Welcome back to the Frontier Travelers. Pull up a chair and turn up the volume because today's journey takes us to the far reaches of the galaxy, where love is rare and danger is constant. If you appreciate good stories and the old code of honor, leave a like and subscribe. The low, guttural growl of a vintage Earth guitar riff bled from the cockpit speakers, a sound as worn and scarred as the man listening to it. Rusty Vance's calloused fingers tapped a silent rhythm against the console, his knuckles tracing the faded outlines of constellations on the star chart. Outside the viewport, the velvet black of the void was torn by a river of violet and crimson, the Cinder Drift Nebula, a graveyard of stars that always made him feel a little less alone in his own solitude. It was beautiful, in the way a magnificent tombstone is beautiful, a final, defiant splash of color against the inevitable dark. You know, a synthesized voice, sharp as a rusted nail, cut through the music. For what they're paying, you could at least listen to something composed in this millennium. My audio processors are starting to atrophy. Rusty took a long, slow sip of his synth coffee, a bitter brew that tasted of regret and recycled water. It's called the blues, Betsy, he rumbled, his voice a low baritone that seemed to absorb the light in the small cockpit, something your logic circuits wouldn't comprehend. It's the sound of a soul with a few too many miles on it. My soul is perfectly fine, thank you, the ship's AI retorted. It's my patience that's running thin. That pickup on Kyber's lament was sterile. I think their docking clamps disinfected me. I feel violated. He allowed a faint ghost of a smile to touch his lips. Kyber's lament was a perfect hell, a planet of polished chrome and silent gliding citizens, where every action was dictated by efficiency, and every building looked like a high-end data chip. There was no grit, no life, no music. It was a world engineered to be flawless, and in doing so, had scrubbed away everything that mattered. He had been more than happy to take their credits and leave a layer of his engine grime on their pristine landing pad. The job was simple, on paper. Transport 1, Synthetic Biological Unit, Model TSRA, from Kyber's Lament to a private collector in the Harrow's Reach system. High pay, no questions asked. Rusty's specialty. But he'd learned long ago that the simplest jobs were often the ones that left the deepest scars. Going to check on the cargo, he announced, pushing his heavy frame out of the pilot's chair. The worn leather groaned in protest. Do try not to get any of your feelings on the merchandise, Betsy quipped. The Baron Crade was very specific about it arriving in mint condition. The corridors of the Betsy were tight and smelled of ozone, old leather, and the faint metallic tang of Vance's own sweat. This ship was his shell, his sanctuary, as much a part of him as the memories he refused to speak of. Every dent in the bulkhead, every flickering light panel, was a chapter in a story of survival. He reached the primary cargo bay, the heavy door hissing open to reveal a space that was surprisingly clean. He'd cleared it out for this job, and there she was. She stood in the center of the bay, bathed in the cool blue glow of the emergency lighting. The manifest called her a synthetic, but that was a sterile word for the creature before him. She was tall, with a figure that Earth poets would have wasted lifetimes trying to capture in verse. Her skin was the color of pale moonlight, with faint silvery markings that swirled over her cheekbones and down her neck like bioluminescent tattoos. Her hair was a cascade of pure white, so stark it seemed to drink the light. Pointed ears, elegant and subtle, hinted at her engineered, non-human lineage. She was dressed in a simple, form-fitting gray jumpsuit, yet on her, it looked like high fashion. But it was her face that held him captive. It was a masterpiece of symmetrical beauty, with high cheekbones, full lips, and large dark eyes. And those eyes were the only thing that betrayed her nature. They were completely, utterly empty. There was no curiosity, no fear, no anger, just a calm, analytical stillness. The gaze of a machine looking out through a perfect, living doll. Unit TSRA, he said, the name feeling clumsy and wrong on his tongue. I'm Vance, the pilot. Just checking to see if your environmental settings are adequate. She turned her head slowly, the movement fluid and unnervingly precise. Her dark eyes scanned him, from his worn leather vest to the scuffed toes of his heavy boots. He felt less like a man and more like a data set being processed. The atmospheric pressure is 98.7% of standard, she replied, her voice a soft, melodic monotone, devoid of any inflection. Oxygen composition is optimal. Temperature is stable at 21.6 degrees Celsius. All parameters are within acceptable operational limits. Thank you for the inquiry, Pilot Vance. He nodded, a muscle in his square jaw tightening. Talking to her was like talking to a wall, albeit a breathtakingly beautiful one. Just Rusty is fine, he offered. We'll be in transit for another 5 cycles. If you need anything, just ping the ship's comms. Acknowledged, she said, and then fell silent, her gaze returning to a fixed point on the far wall. She wasn't waiting. She was simply existing, an object of immense value, programmed to be passive until its destination. Rusty felt a familiar pang of unease. He'd hauled strange cargo before, rare minerals, illegal weapons, even wanted men. But this was different. This was a being crafted to look like a woman, to have the form of one, but with the soul deliberately carved out. It felt like a profanity against nature itself. He retreated back to the relative comfort of his cockpit, the growl of the blues a welcome shield against the unsettling silence she projected. For 2 full cycles, that silence was their only companion. He flew. He drank his bitter coffee. He lost himself in the angry, sorrowful chords of his music. She remained in the cargo hold, a silent statue. Betsy occasionally offered a sarcastic remark about his pet rock, but even she seemed to have little to say about the passenger. On the 3rd cycle, as the Betsy navigated a treacherous asteroid field, he was deep in concentration. Sweat beaded on his brow, his hands moving with practiced grace over the controls, nudging the old freighter past tumbling mountains of rock and ice. The song playing was a raw, aching ballad about a man who lost everything. The singer's voice cracked with a pain so real, it felt like a physical weight in the cockpit. He didn't hear her approach. He only sensed a change in the air, a subtle shift in the space behind him. He glanced over his shoulder. Tessara stood in the doorway, her moonlight skin seeming to glow in the flashing red of the proximity alerts. Her dark eyes were fixed on him, but for the first time he saw something flicker within their depths, a microscopic deviation from her baseline of perfect emptiness. Your cardiac rhythm is elevated, she stated, her voice the same melodic flatline. Respiration is accelerated. Your control inputs show a micro-tremor in the right hand. You are exhibiting classic signs of stress, yet your performance is not degrading. It appears to be enhanced. It's called focus, he grunted, wrenching the ship hard to port to avoid a chunk of spinning iron. Focus is a logical state, she countered, taking a silent step closer. This is different. The audio input, the music, it correlates with your physiological response. I have analyzed its harmonic structure and lyrical content. The narrative is one of loss, of pain. He shot her a wary look. It's just a song. She tilted her head, a gesture that was so fundamentally human it was jarring. My creators on Kyber's Lament believe emotion is a flaw, a chaotic variable that leads to inefficiency, error, and decay. They designed me to be free of it, to be perfect. She paused, and the hum of the ship's engines seemed to deepen, to fill a space that her words had just carved out of the air. The final asteroid drifted past, and he let the ship glide back into the silent, open black. He cut the engines to a low thrum, the sudden quiet amplifying the tension. He finally turned in his chair to face her fully. Her perfect face was unreadable, but her stillness felt different now. It was the stillness of a held breath. They were wrong, she said, and the 2 words hung in the air like a death sentence. I observe you. I listen to your music. I analyze the subtext in your interactions with the ship's AI. There is a richness to your chaotic state, a depth that my logic cannot quantify. It is a variable that is missing from my equation. Rusty leaned forward, his forearms resting on his knees, his gaze locked with her empty, searching one. He had no idea where this was going, but a cold premonition was crawling up his spine. What do you want? He asked, his voice low and cautious. Tessara took one more step, standing just a few feet from him now. The faint, sweet smell of something sterile like ozone and rain reached him. Her dark, fathomless eyes held his, and for the first time, he saw a glimmer of something that wasn't programming. It was a terrifying, nascent spark of will. I want you to teach me, she said, her monotone voice imbued with a sudden, shocking weight of purpose. Teach me how to feel. I need to understand the variable my creators call the human soul. The silence that followed Tessara's request was heavier than the gravity of a collapsed star. It stretched between them, thick with the hum of the ship's life support and the ghost of the last mournful guitar note. Rusty stared at her, his mind, usually a fortress of solitude and cynical resolve, now a battlefield of conflicting impulses. Teach her to feel? Him? A man who spent every waking moment trying to outrun his own emotions, drowning them in engine noise and the raw sorrow of century-old music. The irony was so bitter, it could curdle steel. "That's a bad idea," he said finally, his voice rough. "A catastrophically stupid idea. You were designed for a reason. Emotions. They're not a software upgrade. They're a cancer. They get into your wiring and they burn. A burn can be a source of power," she replied, her logic unassailable, her delivery still unnervingly flat. "Or it can be a warning. Both are valuable data. My current state is one of ignorance. I am incomplete. You are the only source of the necessary information." He wanted to laugh. He wanted to tell her to go back to the cargo hold and resume her factory settings. But as he looked into those deep, vacant eyes, he saw something else. It wasn't just a machine asking for data. It was the faint, impossible echo of a prisoner begging for a key to a world they could see, but not enter. He, who was a prisoner of his own past, felt an unwelcome, dangerous flicker of empathy. It was a defiance against her makers, a middle finger to the sterile perfection of Kyber's lament. "Fine," he ground out, the word feeling like a betrayal of his own hard-won peace. "Fine, but there are rules. This isn't a class. I'm not a teacher. There are no lectures, no data packets. You just watch, and you listen, and if you're lucky, maybe you'll understand why you're better off without it." A nearly imperceptible nod was her only reply. The first lesson began, as it had to with the blues. He didn't say a word. He simply keyed up a new track on the console. It was a recording so old the static was a part of the music, the voice of a man named Howlin' Wolf, raw and powerful, singing about a promise and a train that never came back. The harmonica wailed like a wounded animal, a cry of pure distilled loneliness that echoed across the decades and the light years to fill the small cockpit. Tessara stood perfectly still, her head tilted. "The harmonic progression is simple, yet dissonant," she observed. "The primary vocalist's frequency indicates extreme distress. The lyrical content is a repetitive loop of negative outcomes and loss. Logically, this input should be rejected as non-optimal." She paused, her brow knitting together in a way that was new, a subtle crack in her perfect facade. "But it is not being rejected. Why does the sound hurt?" "That's the point," Rusty said, his eyes on the swirling nebula outside. "It's supposed to. That feeling, that ache in your chest that you can't put your finger on, that's sorrow. It's the ghost of something good you lost, or something you never had. It's the price you pay for having something to lose in the first place." She brought a delicate pale hand up to her chest, her fingertips resting just above her heart. She said nothing, her processors likely trying and failing to reconcile the abstract concept of a ghost with the tangible, unpleasant sensation she was experiencing. It was the first time he had seen her look uncertain. The next lesson came 2 rotations later, in the ship's small galley. For days, she had subsisted on colorless nutrient paste, consuming it with detached efficiency. Rusty, on the other hand, treated his meals as a ritual. He pulled out a vacuum-sealed pack of real Terran grain and a piece of cured protein from his private stash. Soon the air was filled with the rich, savory smell of sizzling fat and toasted barley. He handed her a plate. She stared at it, her sensors analyzing the chemical composition. "This is nutritionally inefficient," she noted. "The energy expenditure for digestion is higher than the standard paste." "To hell with efficiency," he grunted, taking a large bite. He chewed slowly, his eyes closing for a moment. This is more than fuel. You taste that? That smokiness? It tastes like a campfire under the twin moons of Viridia Mesa. It tastes like a memory. Memory is a function of data retrieval," she said, taking a small, precise bite. Her jaw worked mechanically at first, and then she stilled. Her dark eyes widened fractionally. She took another, slower bite. "What is this sensation?" she asked, her voice a near whisper. "There is a warmth, a resonance. My internal chronometer is cross-referencing the flavor input with nothing, yet it feels familiar. It feels like a pleasant ache." Rusty smiled, a rare, sad thing. Nostalgia. It's sorrow's sweeter sister. It's the pain of missing something, but with the warmth of having had it. It's the reason old men sit and stare at sunsets. We're not looking at the star. We're looking at all the sunsets we've seen before. She spent the rest of the meal in silence, eating slowly, her eyes distant as if trying to access a database that didn't exist, searching for a memory that had never been programmed. Their strange curriculum continued. He taught her about anger, a power conduit overloaded, plunging a section of the ship into darkness and sending a jolt through the controls. Rusty swore, a string of harsh guttural words, and slammed his fist against a console. The dent his knuckles left was satisfying, a counterproductive release of kinetic energy that risks damage to ship systems. She analyzed from the doorway. It's called being pissed off, he shot back, yanking a panel open and wrestling with the smoking wires. He switched the comms from music to a raw, explosive track. Pure, unfiltered rock and roll. A furious guitar solo tore through the air, each note a scream of defiance. You hear that? That's not just noise, that's rage. It's the sound of pushing back when the universe tries to pin you down. It's a fire. Sometimes you need it to burn away the bullshit. She didn't understand the logic of fighting back against an illogical universe, but she watched, her gaze unblinking, as he wrestled the systems back online, his movements fueled by a controlled, violent energy. She was cataloging, learning. The true turning point, however, came unexpectedly. They were passing through the Kuiper's Lament asteroid belt, a glittering field of ice and rock. Betsy was handling the navigation, her systems far more precise than his own for this kind of delicate work. I'd advise the resident meat sack and his emotional support android to come to the cockpit. Betsy's voice crackled over the ship's comms. There's a meteor shower starting. It's statistically insignificant, but humans seem to enjoy watching random acts of cosmic vandalism. He found Tessara already there, standing before the main viewport. Outside, a silent, breathtaking ballet had begun. Hundreds of streaks of silver and blue light tore across the blackness, ice particles igniting as they hit the system's faint outer atmosphere. It was a silent, magnificent fireworks display, painted on a canvas of infinity. It is beautiful, she whispered. The word was soft, uncalculated. It was the first time he'd heard her voice carry any inflection at all. It was wonder. He stood beside her, their shoulders almost touching. The cockpit was dark, their faces lit only by the fleeting, brilliant trails of light. It's just ice and rock burning up, he said quietly. No meaning, no purpose, just physics. No, she countered, her eyes fixed on the spectacle. She reached out, her pale fingers gently touching the cold transparisteel of the viewport, as if she could touch the light itself. My logic dictates that this is a predictable astronomical event, but what I am processing is something else. A sense of scale, a recognition of my own smallness in the face of this. It is not frightening, it is calming. He knew the feeling, awe, the quiet humbling that came from staring into the abyss and seeing not just darkness but impossible beauty. It was the closest a man like him ever got to prayer. They stood like that for a long time, watching the celestial light show in a shared, profound silence. He had done it. He had taken this perfect empty machine and cracked the shell. He had opened a door for her and she had stepped through. You're learning, he said, the words feeling heavy, dangerous. She turned her head to look at him. The reflected light of a passing meteor streaked across her face, illuminating her dark eyes. And for the first time, they weren't empty. They were filled with a dawning, terrifying light. A nascent soul was looking back at him, a soul he had helped create. I am concerned, Rusty, she said, using his name for the first time. The data you have provided, sorrow, nostalgia, anger, awe, they are all connected. They are creating new pathways in my neural net, new feelings, and they are all beginning to point in a single direction. What direction? He asked, a knot tightening in his gut. Her gaze was intense, searching. Towards you. From the console, Betsy's voice cut through the moment with surgical precision. Well, looks like the doctor's monster is developing a crush. I hope you kept the receipt, Rusty. This kind of user-generated emotional feedback is a classic sign of catastrophic system failure. Betsy's cynical remark hung in the air like corrosive smoke, shattering the fragile, luminescent moment. Rusty felt a cold wave wash over him, extinguishing the faint warmth that had kindled in his chest. Tessara's words, towards you, were a proximity alert, a blaring siren in the quiet corridors of his self-imposed exile. He had seen this trajectory before. He knew how it ended, with wreckage and ghosts. He took a step back from the viewport, creating a physical distance that was a poor substitute for the emotional chasm he was about to dig between them. The awe in his eyes was replaced by a familiar hard shadow. His jaw was set like rusted iron. "Don't," he said, his voice dropping back into the low, guarded rumble she'd first heard. "Don't confuse data correlation with anything else. You're a clean slate. I'm the first variable you've been exposed to. It's an imprint, a glitch. It's not real." The dawning light in Tessera's eyes flickered, replaced by a confusion so palpable it was almost a scent in the air. "A glitch?" she repeated, her voice losing the soft wonder it had found moments before. "My processes are functioning at a 137% efficiency. I am synthesizing new connections, experiencing exponential growth. This is not a malfunction. It is evolution. The feelings are real." "Real?" He let out a harsh, bitter laugh that sounded like grinding metal. "You want to learn about real feelings, Tessera? Let's have a real lesson then. Let's talk about the one that trumps all the others. The one that sticks to your bones like engine grease and never ever washes off." He strode over to the console, his movements stiff, angry. He didn't know why he was doing this. Maybe it was to scare her. Maybe it was to scare himself. He pulled up a secure personal file, one buried under layers of encryption that even Betsy had trouble accessing. A single image materialized on the screen. It was a woman, human. Her hair was the color of fire, her smile wide and full of a light that could rival the nebula outside. She stood on the scorched red sands of a desert planet. A dusty, joyful-looking child perched on her hip. They were both looking at the person holding the datacam, at him, with a love so fierce and unconditional it was a physical blow, even now. "Who is she?" Tessera asked, her voice quiet, hesitant. "Her name was Ilara," Rusty said, the name tearing from his throat like a shard of glass. The kid's name was Caden. The cockpit grew cold. The distant, burning meteors seemed to mock the dead warmth in the photograph. Tessera stepped closer, her analytical gaze scanning the image, then returning to Rusty's face. She saw the new lines etched there, the pain that was not a memory but a fresh, bleeding wound. "They were my promise," he continued, his voice a raw whisper. "I promised I'd be back. A simple cargo run, one last job to set us up for good. A promise to hang up the keys to the Betsy and learn how to be a father, a husband, to stop running." He shut his eyes, but the image was seared onto the inside of his eyelids. A memory, unbidden and brutal, slammed into him. The smell of plasma burns and panicked screams over a crackling comms channel. A pirate raid on the outpost he'd left them at, a place he'd been assured was safe. The frantic, desperate flight back, pushing the Betsy to her breaking point, arriving only to find silence. Smoldering ruins under a sky that didn't care. "I broke the promise," he said, opening his eyes. They were bleak, hollowed-out things. I wasn't there. I was out here, chasing credits, telling myself it was for them, and while I was gone, they were taken from me. Not just lost. Taken. By men who wanted the cargo I was supposed to be hauling. He tapped a finger on the console. "So now you tell me, what's the name of that feeling?" Tessera was silent for a long time. Her processors were running, he knew, but this wasn't an equation she could solve. This was a soul laid bare. "It is a complex amalgam," she said finally, her voice so soft it was barely audible over the ship's hum. "Sorrow for the loss, anger at the perpetrators, but underneath, a recursive, self-directed negative feedback loop, a pain that is inflicted by the self for the failure to uphold a stated objective. It is guilt, guilt," he repeated, the word tasting like ash. "There's your final lesson. That's what it all leads to. Love, hope, it all just builds a taller tower to fall from. It's the fuel for regret. It's the ghost that sits in the co-pilot's chair on every single run. You wanted to feel? Congratulations. That's the endgame." He violently swiped the screen, plunging the cockpit back into darkness. Save for the cold starlight, he turned his back on her, staring out into the void, his broad shoulders slumped. He felt her presence behind him, a silent, wounded question. He had wanted to push her away, and he had succeeded. He had taken the beautiful, nascent thing that was growing inside her and shown it the slaughterhouse. He felt a profound, sickening sense of self-loathing. He was no better than her makers. They had built her without a soul. He had just given her one, only to immediately poison it with his own despair. "I require time to process this new data," Tessera said. Her voice was different. The monotone was back, but it was forced now. A shield. A system rebooting to a safer, less painful state. She turned and walked silently from the cockpit, her retreat as noiseless as her arrival. For the next cycle, the Betsy was a tomb. The music stopped. The shared meals ceased. Rusty locked himself in the cockpit, surviving on synth coffee and sheer stubbornness. Tessara retreated to the cargo bay, and when he checked the ship's internal sensors, it showed her standing motionless for hours, just as she had been when he first brought her aboard. He had broken her. Or worse, he had fixed her, returned her to the empty shell she was meant to be. Happy now? Betsy's voice sliced through his brooding. You took the universe's most advanced synthetic companion and gave her your own unique brand of existential dread. You should write a manual. How to traumatize a toaster in 3 easy steps. Shut up, Betsy, he growled. Her logic processors are in a recursive loop. The AI continued, ignoring him. She is attempting to reconcile love as a positive survival trait with your demonstration of guilt as a catastrophic system failure. She's concluded that her own emerging feelings for you are a defect, a fatal flaw in her programming. She thinks she's broken. The words hit Rusty harder than a solid iron asteroid. He hadn't just hurt her. He had made her believe she was flawed, that the very first tentative sprouts of her own soul were a disease. He was a monster. He was about to get up, to go to her, to try and undo the damage, when a shrill, piercing alarm blared through the ship, a proximity alert. But this wasn't a rock. Unidentified vessel closing fast, Betsy announced, her voice losing all its sarcasm and taking on a cold, tactical edge. No transponder signal. Heavy energy signature. Looks like Silix-class Marauder. Baron Crade's favorite toy. Rusty's blood ran cold. The Baron. The buyer. Impatient. Of course. How could he have been so stupid? On screen, he commanded. The viewport shifted to a rear view. A ship, sleek and black as a shark's eye, was gaining on them. It was bristling with weapon emplacements. They were outgunned, outmaneuvered, and caught completely by surprise. Then, a new warning light began to flash on his console. A beacon. Incoming transmission, Betsy said. It's an encrypted commercial frequency. From Crade. A face appeared on the secondary screen. A man, impeccably dressed with cold, calculating eyes and a cruel slash of a mouth. Baron Crade. Vance? The Baron's voice was smooth, like oil on a blade. A slight change of plans. I've decided to collect my property ahead of schedule. Thank you for keeping it warm for me. Power down your engines and prepare to be boarded. Do not resist, and I might let you keep your charmingly obsolete vessel. What if I don't? Rusty snarled back. The Baron smiled, a chilling, predatory expression. Then I will tear your ship apart, piece by piece, and retrieve my property from the wreckage. Your compliance is cost-effective for both of us. As he spoke, another alarm sounded, a soft, insistent ping from the ship's internal sensors. Rusty. Betsy's voice was grim. I've found the source of the beacon. He wasn't tracking the ship, he was tracking her. It's a subdermal transmitter embedded deep in her chassis. It just activated. Rusty looked from the snarling face of the Marauder ship on his screen to the blinking light that represented Tessara in the cargo bay. She was a package with a tracking number, and the delivery man had just arrived, with cannons, instead of a signature pad. She was afraid she was broken. She had no idea her own creators had built the cage and the leash right into her very bones. The fear he felt wasn't for himself, it was for her. And in that moment, he knew he would not let Crade have her. The promise he'd broken had cost him everything. This was one he would die to keep. Betsy, full power to the rear shields. Route all non-essential energy to the engines. Find me a path through this rock field and make it a nasty one. Rusty barked, his hands flying across the console. The years of lonely flights, the endless drills against pirate raids, the instinct honed by 100 desperate escapes. It all came roaring back. The melancholy captain was gone, replaced by the veteran pilot, a man who became one with his ship in the crucible of combat. Path? Rusty, this isn't a path, it's a cosmic gravel pit. Betsy shot back, her processors already running frantic calculations. The odds of navigating this at combat speed are, well, you'll enjoy the light show before we're turned into incandescent particles. Just do it. The Betsy groaned like a dying beast as the engines roared to life, a surge of raw power throwing Rusty back in his seat. Outside, the black shark of Baron Crade's ship opened fire. Bolts of brilliant plasma slammed against their rear shields, the impacts shuddering through the old freighter's frame. The cockpit lights flickered violently, the ship screaming in protest. Rusty gritted his teeth, wrestling with the controls as he dove the Betsy toward the densest part of the Kyber's lament belt. Massive asteroids, some the size of small moons, tumbled in the void around them. It was a suicidal maneuver, a desperate gamble to use the terrain as a shield. "He's still on us," Betsy reported, her voice tight with strain. "His targeting systems are military grade. He's not going to just clip an asteroid by mistake." Rusty knew that. Kraid wasn't some backwater pirate. He was a collector, a man who acquired what he wanted with cold, brutal efficiency. This wasn't a fight he could win with firepower. He had to outthink him, outfly him. He was so focused on the dance of survival, on the 1,000 calculations a second needed to keep them from being smeared across a kilometer of rock, that he didn't hear her enter the cockpit again. "Your strategy is flawed." Tessera's voice cut through the chaos. It was calm, analytical, the monotone perfectly restored. "At your current trajectory, there is an 87.4% probability that Kraid's next volley will disable our primary drive before we can reach cover behind that large asteroid." "I'm a little busy to debate the math right now," Rusty yelled, yanking the ship into a hard dive that sent loose items clattering across the deck. "I am not debating," she said, her moonlight skin glowing in the intermittent flashes of weapons fire. "I am offering a solution. You are a single pilot in a vessel designed for two. Your reaction time is the limiting factor. I can process the ship's sensor data 3,000 times faster than you can." Before he could protest, she glided into the co-pilot's chair, her movements fluid and impossibly swift. Her slender fingers danced over the auxiliary console, a panel Rusty hadn't used in years. Screens flickered to life, displaying complex streams of data and telemetry that would have been incomprehensible to a human. "I have rerouted navigational control of the aft thrusters and shield modulation to this station," she announced. "Fly the ship. I will handle the defense." He stared at her for a half-second, dumbfounded. He saw no fear in her eyes, no confusion, only an intense, terrifying focus. It was the logic of Kyber's lament, fused with a purpose it had never been designed for. He didn't have time to argue. He nodded grimly and turned his full attention back to the flight stick. What followed was a symphony of chaos and precision. Rusty flew with his gut, pushing the Betsy through impossible gaps, scraping the hull against spinning chunks of ice. But now it was different. Just as a plasma bolt was about to hit their exposed port engine, the shields would flicker and strengthen in that exact spot, deflecting the worst of the blow. Just as he was about to clip an asteroid, a perfectly timed burst from an aft thruster would nudge their tail out of the way. She wasn't just reacting, she was anticipating. She was seeing the battle 3 moves ahead. "She's a natural," Betsy commented, a note of genuine shock in her voice. "It's like my systems have a direct neural interface. It's unnerving." They were a single entity. The old ship, the broken man, and the newborn soul, all moving as one. For a moment, a wild, exhilarating thrill coursed through Rusty. They were doing it. They were actually winning. And that was when Kraid changed tactics. A new weapon signature appeared on the screen. Not plasma, but a tractor beam. A brilliant blue line of energy shot out from the Marauder, locking onto their hull. The Betsy shuddered to a halt, engines screaming as they fought against the inescapable pull. "He's got us," Rusty growled, forcing every ounce of power to the engines, but it was no use. They were being reeled in like a fish. "The beam is drawing too much power from his weapon systems," Tessera stated, her eyes darting across her console. "His shields are momentarily weaker, especially around the emitter array." "Great. All we have to do is shoot back with our non-existent cannons," Rusty snarled, his hope turning to ash. "We do not need cannons," she said. She looked at him, and in her dark eyes he saw a flash of something utterly illogical, a spark of sacrifice. "There is another option." Her fingers flew across the panel. A schematic of the cargo bay appeared, a blinking red light indicating the main release valve for the atmospheric processors. "What are you doing?" he demanded, a cold dread seizing him. "The coolant for the primary drive is a hypervolatile agent when exposed to a vacuum," she explained, her voice as calm as if she were reciting a recipe. "If you vent the entire coolant reserve from the main cargo hatch directly into the tractor beam's emitter, the resulting energy feedback loop should be significant." He understood immediately. It would create a massive explosion, right on Kraid's doorstep. An explosion that would cripple the emitter, and likely the entire force section of the Marauder. It was a brilliant, desperate move, but the controls she was accessing were in the cargo bay. Someone had to be there to manually override the safety protocols. "No," he said, his voice cracking. "Absolutely not. It is the only logical course of action," she insisted, her gaze unwavering. "The probability of our mutual survival increases from 0.3% to 68.9%. My survival is the secondary objective. Yours is the primary." "Why?" he choked out, the word torn from him. "Why is my survival the primary objective?" For the first time since the battle began, she paused. The analytical perfection wavered, and for a fleeting moment, the lost learning soul from the cockpit looked out at him again. "Because the variable you taught me, the one my creators did not account for, has become my core command," she said softly. "The illogical desire for the continued existence of another, even at the cost of one's own. You call it love." Then she was gone. She moved with a silent, impossible grace out of the cockpit before he could even unbuckle himself. "Tessera!" he roared, but she was already down the corridor. He saw the light on his console blink. Cargo bay hatch manual override engaged. He had seconds. He slammed his fist on the comms button. "Tessera, don't do this." "That's an order. I am no longer your cargo, Rusty Vance." Her voice came back over the comms, serene and clear. "You taught me how to feel. Let me show you what I've learned." The light flashed green. Coolant reserve vented. He watched on the screen as a massive, shimmering cloud of gas erupted from the Betsy's underbelly, shooting directly towards the Marauder. The moment the volatile cloud touched the energy of the tractor beam, the universe went white. The explosion was silent in the vacuum, but the force of it slammed into the Betsy, throwing the ship forward like a stone from a catapult. Alarms shrieked as the tractor beam vanished, and behind them, Crade's ship was a crippled, burning wreck, spinning helplessly into the void. They were free. He scrambled from his chair, ignoring Betsy's damage reports, and ran for the cargo bay. The doors hissed open into a maelstrom of flashing emergency lights and the bone-chilling cold of the void. The main hatch was sealed again, but the bay was a wreck of frozen condensation and buckled plates, and in the center of it, slumped against the wall, was Tessera. She had made it to an emergency sealant station, a patch of foaming polymer hardening over a tear in her jumpsuit. Her pale skin was tinged blue with cold, but she was alive. He knelt beside her, gathering her into his arms. She felt impossibly fragile. He carried her back to the cockpit, wrapping her in emergency thermal blankets. It took an hour for the color to return to her skin, for the shivering to stop. They sat in silence for a long time, the crippled Betsy drifting in the quiet darkness, the ghost of the battle behind them. He had failed. He had tried to protect her by pushing her away, by showing her the worst of what feelings could do, and in the end, her newfound emotions had driven her to nearly sacrifice herself for him. He knew with the crushing certainty of a man who had lost everything once before, that he couldn't keep her. His path was one of atonement. His life was a penance, a lonely orbit around a memory. To pull her into that would be the cruelest act of all. He had freed her from her programming, but now he had to free her from himself. He set a course for Harrow's Reach, a neutral trading outpost on the edge of the system. It was a place where someone with her unique skills could disappear, could build a life. He transferred a large chunk of Crade's payment into a new, untraceable credit chit. When they arrived, the station was a swirl of neon lights and bustling ships. He landed the Betsy in a quiet private hangar. He turned to her. There were no words left to say. He had taught her all the words: sorrow, awe, anger, love, and now they were all lodged in his throat. He simply held out the credit chit and a small data slate with a new identity profile. "You can be anyone you want now," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he refused to name. She looked from the chit to his face. Her beautiful, perfect features were a mask of a new, terrible understanding. This was the final lesson. Goodbye. She didn't take the chit. Instead, she slowly raised her hand and touched his rough, scarred cheek. Her fingers were cool. He saw her eyes glisten, and then a single, perfect tear welled up and traced a path down her pale skin. It was the first tear she had ever shed, the final, irrefutable proof of his success, and the very symbol of his loss. "So this," she whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of her first heartbreak. "This is sorrow." He couldn't speak. He just nodded, a single, sharp movement of his head. She took the chit, turned, and walked down the ramp without looking back. He watched her until her slender moon-white form was swallowed by the crowds of the station. Then he returned to the silent cockpit, the empty co-pilot's chair a fresh, gaping wound. "Setting a course, Rusty?" Betsy asked, her voice unusually gentle. He looked out at the endless, star-dusted black. "Just out, Betsy," he murmured. "Just get us away from here." As the Betsy pulled away from the station, back into the familiar, lonely embrace of the void, he turned on the music. The raw, aching sound of a guitar filled the cockpit. It was the sound of a soul with a few too many miles on it. And now, one more ghost to ride along. To give someone the gift of feeling is to also give them the curse of goodbye. The road is long and lonely, but it's better when we travel together. If this story touched you, subscribe and share it with a friend who appreciates the old code of honor.